Well, we are thrilled to have David Instone-Brewer with us all the way from the UK. David, I'd like you to introduce yourself to our audience briefly first. Just tell everybody who you are and a little bit about your academic background and what you do.
Hi, I'm David. I'm a Baptist pastor, though I've been seconded by the Baptist Union into the academic world, which is a great place to be because I'm at Tyndale House, where I get to meet all the best scholars from around the world. They come for their sabbaticals and breaks and to do further degrees. So I get to meet everyone just by standing in one place, and that place is a very nice place in Cambridge. So I've got a lovely wife and daughters, so I'm in a good place.
Yeah, it sounds quite good. Tell us a little bit about Tyndale House. What is its purpose?
It's an academic research institute in Cambridge. It's attached to the university, but not part of it. We have arguably the third best library in the world, maybe the best, but among the top three for biblical studies. The others being the École Biblique in Jerusalem and the Pontifical Institute in Rome. Mm-hmm. And it's just a superb place to do research because everything is there in one little place. And if by any chance we don't have the book, 5 minutes down the road is a library with another 8 million books.
Right. Yeah, they should have it then. Yeah. Now, before we transition to our actual topic, I mean, I would like people to know about your website as well. So I want to do that here before I forget it. Because you've been, I think it's fair to say, at the forefront of providing digital resources online for biblical study. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Yeah, I rely on computers because I have a very poor memory for most things. So I make tools for using on computers with there are various things. Either Step Bible is probably the most important one at the moment. That's Step, one word, Bible, stepbible.org or .com. And that's for reading the Bible in any language you want to read it. I think there's 280 languages there. And it takes you straight through to the Greek and Hebrew if you want to go there. And you can then explore as deep as you like, or just read the Bible along with any number of other Bibles in parallel or interlinear or linear. It's a great thing just to play around and read the Bible.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, that was sort of our initial attachment because I was at Logos, and of course we had heard about you, and I know there was some back and forth there, and eventually you came in to do a mobile ed course, and so we've had an attachment of sorts, over the years. Obviously at a distance because you're in the UK, but I've read your work in a number of different areas and did an article through the journal that you edit, the Tyndale Journal. And so, again, we've had this attachment, on and off, back and forth. And I've been accustomed to your scholarship. And when I get questions a lot on divorce and remarriage, and I'm not a pastor. I'm a geek, I don't really have a whole lot of experience really, talking to people directly about, these kinds of issues. I mean, obviously we all run into it either, in our own, efforts to maintain our marriage or, relatives, people in our family. So everybody sort of experiences this in some way. And in the course of getting questions, I have, looked at your book, off and on a number of times, just to get some guidance. And I figured after this latest round, I got peppered with, 3 or 4 other, more questions, kind of all in succession, a few, months back. And I thought, we really need to do this on the podcast. And, what better source could there be other than David Instone-Brewer, and I not only want to promote your book, and before I forget about that, this is a terrific resource, David's book. Why don't you just tell the audience a little bit about the book, when it came out, what the reception's been. So I want to promote that because I do think it's a great resource, but to actually have you on the podcast, really we're going to do 2 episodes, sort of an Old Testament and a New Testament. I just think is great for our audience.
Yeah, it's Divorce and Remarriage in the Bible. I brought that out in 2001. and followed it up fairly soon after with divorce and remarriage in the church, because the one in the Bible deals with all the technical issues, all the different manuscripts in Jewish sources and Babylonian sources and early church sources. But in the divorce and remarriage in the Bible is not for the person who's in the pew necessarily. So I wrote Divorce and Remarriage in the Church to bring out the more pastoral issues and the applications. So I'm not quite sure which one you've read, Mike. I guess it was the Divorce and Remarriage in the Bible.
In the Bible. And this audience, believe it or not, I know, if you get this book, you're going to see, Greek and Hebrew in it and whatnot. But this audience is used to, even if they don't have a year or so of either of the languages, they will jump into stuff like this and try to navigate it. So I figured, it would be a good, again, idea to do an episode on, 2 episodes actually on the subject matter. And I think this is still a great resource. We value on this podcast, we value primary texts. We value taking scripture in its own ancient context. And this is the sort of book that if you're having to deal at all with the divorce and remarriage issue, you're going to want this as a resource. And so that's why, I'm not afraid to recommend the big one, the one with footnotes and Greek and Hebrew in it. Yeah. But I'm glad to hear you mention the other one.
The Greek and Hebrew is always translated because I recognize that, hey, why should someone need to know it all? And I always explain my sources carefully. So if it's a reference to an ancient document which really doesn't make sense in the first place, then I explain it. So it's not like these technical works which have reams of Latin which they don't bother to translate.
Right. It's not like Mandelkern or something.
and I've been really pleased with the way in which academic institutions have received it. There's one institution that actually uses this book not as a way to teach ethics, but as a way in which to teach hermeneutics. How do we deal with a text? How do we interpret it? How do we look at the context? How do we look at the languages? How do we look at the culture and put it all together to find out what the text says? And they use this book for that, which I was really surprised at and wonderful.
Yeah, that is really, that's actually a good idea. I mean, now that I actually hear somebody doing that, it's like, that would work well. Why didn't I think of that before? Yeah, that's a great idea because it really is a good model for that. So I encourage everybody listening to check this book out and get it. It's a great resource. So with having said all that, I want to jump in here. Again, this episode, we're going to be talking more or less about Old Testament. We'll see how far we get, but I'm hoping we get into into the Second Temple period. We can sort of set up the next episode, which is really New Testament focused. But to jump in here, you begin the book with a chapter on the ancient Near East, and you emphasize in that chapter that marriage is a contract. Okay, this is a legal contract in the ancient Near East. And then, of course, that is something you're going to take into the discussion of the Old Testament material. But could you unpack that a little bit? Because I think a lot of people in the audience who are Christians, sort of tend to think about marriage more ethereally, like, oh, it's, just something that in the sight of God, this and that. But it's actually a legal thing. I mean, we sort of know that in the modern world, but I have noticed that there's something of a tendency to kind of theologize it too much, to sort of take it out of its contract moorings and its context. So to start with, what kind of contract are we talking about here? Summarize that chapter for us.
Well, often we talk about marriage as a covenant, but in Old English, covenant and contract were exactly the same thing. It was an agreement between two people with stipulations and usually with penalties. If you don't keep your half of the covenant or contract, then there's a penalty to you. Or if the person doing the deal with you doesn't deliver, then there's a penalty.
That doesn't sound romantic.
It doesn't. No. But the two words, contract and covenants, have gradually split apart. And actually in America, covenant means something rather different in law than it does in the UK. In UK law, a covenant is something which you inherit as part of who you are. So if you buy a house, you inherit a covenant, which puts various limitations on how you use that land. along with the house. Or if you have a job, there'll be a legal covenant, which is part of that job. It's not something you have to sign in order to have to fulfill. In America, a covenant is an agreement which doesn't have penalties attached. It's you keep it just as a matter of honor. And I think it's that meaning which has come into the sort of sense of marriage not being a legal thing. It's a matter of something you do because you're a decent person and you keep the laws of marriage. But these are just ways in which the language is developed. In the Old Testament, there's just one word, it's berit, which is for all covenants, all contracts. And they have penalties, they have clauses. It's legal jargon. Laban makes these contracts with Jacob, or you have Solomon making contract with Hiram to deliver wood. And if Hiram doesn't deliver wood, then Solomon won't pay by sending his end of the deal. And there's no friendship involved. It's just a contract. It's just a berit. It's a covenant. It's legal. And when you come to marriage, you've got exactly the same thing. They have a document which you still know about from the modern Jewish marriages. We have this long marriage contract, which delineates exactly how much money is coming in from both sides. And it says in the old versions and from Jesus' day that the woman's going to be doing the cooking and the man's going to be providing the food, and that each side has obligations and each side will receive things. And it's a contract.
Yeah. What are some of you talked about, again, terms. In your book, you cover terminology for payment. Okay, there were different kinds of payments. So let's talk about some of the ingredients, if you will, the elements of the contract. Other than I'm going to do this, you're going to do that. There was actually money or property or wealth transferred to sort of cement this agreement.
Well, the place in the Bible where we see this most strongly is, of course, when Jacob tries to get his wife and gets married to the wrong one and then has to work another 7 years for the right one. And there's very clearly a payment being involved there. Different parts of society and different parts of the Old Testament have slightly different customs, but the mohar, the payment, the bride's price, is the common one in the Old Testament. And it's strange in different parts of the world. You have either that you have the groom having to pay, or you have the bride's family having to pay. And I've never figured out how this comes about one way or the other. But we still have payment in our marriages. That's why you have the exchange of rings. It's a what the lawyers call a consideration. Without a consideration, there's no contract. And the consideration that we give is a ring. And you only have to give the bride a ring because in our culture, the money comes from the groom. But nowadays, we tend to exchange rings. So there's still this concept of a price being paid. And of course, in some cultures, it's absolutely terrible. Indian cultures, there's huge payments, and a lot of African cultures, people just can't afford to get married. So we still have this payment, and this, which is part of a contract.
Yeah. Do you think it's fair to say, okay, again, just going back to, and there's bound to be somebody in the audience who, this has popped into their head or they've heard it, but again, this notion that, well, I don't want the state involved, in marriage. The state shouldn't have any say in whether I'm actually married or not. I'm going to promise myself to this, this person. And in the sight of God, that's good enough. So I think, it would be fair to say that really wouldn't be a biblical marriage because you have this exchange. Do you think that's fair?
In the Bible, you have things exactly like that. It is called being a concubine.
There you go.
The definition of a wife, in contradistinction to a concubine, is a wife has exchanged vows with the husband before witnesses. If that hasn't happened, then the woman is a concubine. And the legal difference is a concubine doesn't have the ownership of any children. The children all belong to the husband. The concubine can be sent out of the house at any point, and the concubine doesn't have legal rights to any property. But for a wife, the wife shares the property of the husband and shares the rights to children. though it's not quite the same rights that we have nowadays. But it's very close model. The concubine is but in many details, is exactly like what we call a common law wife, someone who is living with a man without a public ceremony of marriage.
Now, that's actually a nice transition into really, I think, in a lot of respects, the kind of the guts of the matter here in the Old Testament. That's Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. There's also sort of this inclination or this assumption that, well, back in the Old Testament, this is patriarchal culture, and the women didn't really have any rights. They had no recourse. They're essentially property, so on and so forth. And there are patriarchal isms, just to use the most broad term that pops into my head. But the woman did have property rights here, and a lot of that goes back to Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. So I'd really like to spend some time hearing you talk about that passage in relationship to the contractual nature of marriage, and how that really, honestly, how that was a blessing for a woman, that this contractual relationship.
Yeah, the situation you describe of a woman not having any property rights is, as far as we can tell, how it was in most of the ancient Near East. We have the remains of laws from Hammurabi and other law codes, and women are very much property themselves rather than owning property. And if you get dismissed by your husband, the children belong to him. They are valuable assets because they can plough the land and they can do work for the family business, and you just lose them. Or if your husband goes away sometime and you're not quite sure if he's going to come back, and you marry someone else, well, when he returns, he can just claim you back and claim back any children that you've had in the meantime with this other man. So a woman really didn't have many legal rights. And that's why Deuteronomy 24 is so different. It just stands out as a gold standard in the ancient Near East, because there you can see that the woman, when she's dismissed, she has to be given a certificate of divorce. Now, without that, if she didn't have a certificate saying, yes, I'm divorcing you, you're now free to marry anyone you wish, then the man could come back at any point and just take her.
Mm-hmm.
So no one would marry her again because, hey, they're going to lose any children they've had in the meantime, lose all the assets they've given to the woman. Well, anyway, you don't make any emotional commitment to someone who might just be taken from you. So having a divorce certificate like that was such a wonderful thing, that there is a sort of equivalent to it in one ancient Near Eastern law, where a high-level commander, when he goes off to war, he has to give his wife a divorce certificate in case he doesn't return. And then she's got something that can say, okay, I'm free to marry. And but that was a great privilege. And here, Moses says it's for every single Jewess has this right, that if the man leaves her, he has to give her a certificate saying she's now free of him and she can marry someone else.
What about the, how does this play out into the latter part of the passage? We might as well just read it. I'll read it quickly. This is ESV, Deuteronomy 24. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies, who took her to be his wife, then her former husband, who sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. So, we tend to look at this, and I think, I'm just going to put it this way. I think we sort of read it completely negatively because of words like, indecency and defilement and things like that. But there's actually a lot more to it. So how does this whole thing work if this is a great thing, for her to be given a certificate of divorce because it allows her the freedom to remarry without the fear of just being arbitrarily claimed. I mean, take us through this scenario of what these verses are actually describing.
With case law, which you have in the Old Testament, you always define for rights the very minimum requisite to get those rights, and for obligations you get the worst case. So here you have a woman who is definitely in worst case wife. I mean, she's terrible. She's been, her first husband found some indecency in her, a matter of nakedness, it says. We don't know what it is, but hey, it's bad enough that he wants to get rid of her. And then she goes off and marries someone else, and he hates her and sends her away. And in both cases, this woman, you wouldn't expect this woman to get a divorce certificate, but the law says even this woman should get a divorce certificate. So the negative is there deliberately. This is the worst case scenario, and even that woman has to have a divorce certificate. So it's a right which is for everyone. But you're right, the actual case that's described here, it's abysmal, isn't it?
Would a woman who has a certificate of divorce, does that mean to others that she was divorced legitimately, or this is or is it just wider? It's really any case. Does this signify the rightness of the divorce, or is it sort of neutral?
We don't know what the wording is back then, but in the rabbinic times, they said the minimum wording that has to be on a divorce certificate is "You are now free to marry any man you wish."
Mm-hmm. So that's the minimum legal statement that basically the husband has to say yes to that. Yes, this is what's written on there, and give it to the wife. So like he couldn't take that out, is what you're saying. That's the minimum requirement.
Yeah. And he can't say, and you can only marry, you can't marry so-and-so, or something like that. You're now free to marry any man you wish. They did allow them to add a Jewish man, because obviously a Jewess wouldn't marry a non-Jew. But yes, that wording is very similar to wording we find in that case of the senior military man. They have wording very similar to that. And it's also very similar to wording that you find in other Neo-Babylonian documents. So it's quite likely this wording does go right the way back to the 1400s or whatever, when Moses was giving his laws. That wording would make sense in this situation, because, as you say, he's not saying anything good about her. He's just saying, okay, I'm done with you, and you're now free to go off.
Okay. And so, again, the scenario is actually, let's say she goes out, she has the certificate, so she's allowed to remarry. Regardless of what the circumstance was, she is allowed to remarry because she has this certificate. And then she gets married again. And then the worst case scenario, like you said, the second husband, again, hates her, quote unquote, from verse 3. And he also writes her out a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. So I presume that we assume that it's the same kind of document. He says, hey, you can get married again, but I'm done with you. Or again, if the latter man dies, he sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies, so she's, sort of by herself now, obviously. Then her former husband, though, is not allowed to take her again. Why? What is that preventing?
That's a mystery. I haven't seen any convincing explanation of this. This is a bit of case law, and this is how Old Testament works for some of the laws. Some of the laws are lists of regulations. Some of the laws are cases, such as with the Sabbath law, that they find a man picking up sticks, and therefore they decide, no, that is work, and that mustn't be done, and you mustn't light a fire on the Sabbath. You get case law, like in the US and like in the UK, case law builds up into actual law. So this is an actual case. Something has actually happened like this, and we don't know exactly what it is, why they're saying this second time she can't go back to her former husband. And there are some theories. You've probably heard of some of these theories.
Is this Westbrook's idea about the first husband would essentially be trying to if the second, let's put it this way, if the second dowry, if she comes into money with the second marriage, that he's going to go and try to reclaim her? Is that what you're thinking of here? That
Yep.
Yeah. Well, let's just go there. Why don't we unpack that? Because Raymond Westbrook is an expert in ancient Near Eastern law, for those who are not familiar with his name, and he has sort of a take on this that is interesting. The first marriage ends, and he writes the woman, the wife that he's sending away, a certificate of divorce, just like you should do, for whatever the matter of indecency was. Again, that's pretty nebulous. But the fact that, again, if he did have a valid ground for doing that, let's just, again, we have to assume that, but like she had broken the marriage agreement or something, however they define, the validity here, then what happens to her dowry, that she is given at the beginning of the marriage? I mean, there's that issue. What happens to that? She goes and remarries and she gets another dowry. And the first guy says, well, that one's bigger than the one, that we had. And so I'm going to try to reclaim her so I can get to the money. I mean, do you think there's any validity to that idea?
I think it's a great idea. It's very, very creative. That's the mild British way of saying no. It won't work.
So you don't think there's enough evidence for Westbrook to make his case, is what you're saying?
Well, it isn't written in those terms. It's not written in terms that you can't keep collecting dowries. It's written in terms that you can't marry any wife like this that you've been married to before. And why not? She can marry a complete stranger. She can marry someone that she's committed adultery with. She can marry anyone, but she can't marry the person she was originally married to, which is weird. And
right. And because it is weird, that people have been looking for ways to explain the logic of it.
Yeah.
And again,
it's very strong language. It's an abomination, a word that's usually used for idolatry. It's it's a religious thing. It's the whole country is going to be defiled if this happens, and it's just a money thing.
Do you think that he's also reading the validity angle in? Because again, if the indecency is really undefined, how can you be more precise than that? You know what I mean? It just how do you apply any precision to that?
I don't think this is supposed to be precise. It's
right.
It was an actual case, but they want to bring generalities out of it. And so they're not going into the precise details of that case because, hey, it's got to become general law. But this not marrying the original husbands, I have a pet theory.
Okay. We like pet theories.
It's a pet theory.
They're okay if they're clearly labeled.
Yeah, I haven't written it up in a scholarly journal, so I haven't had any comeback from other scholars about it. So I'll wait for your experts who are listening now to come back and say it's rubbish. I came across this when I was looking on Sunni websites I was just interested in Islamic law, and no, it's Shiites. It was the website of a prominent Shiite cleric who was giving answers to questions. Amazing. People were asking all sorts of questions. And they were asking about this pleasure marriage, a muta marriage. You can look it up on Wikipedia, a muta marriage in Shiite law. What it means is you can marry someone just for a short period. You can enter into a marriage agreement with a girl, with a woman, for a few nights and then end it. And it's just temporary, just a temporary marriage. Now, they don't recommend this. This isn't something that's is a terrible scandal in Shiite Islam. It's just something they've inherited and it is still practiced, but, I'd almost say under the covers, but
right, they're not out there flag waving for it.
Yeah, no,
it's still there. Yeah,
it's still part of Islam, and presumably it was part of the culture, and probably part of the hospitality culture. And you can imagine that someone comes along. Hospitality is so important in Arabic culture, and including before Islam was learned by the Arab tribes. And you give them every comfort you can imagine. You give them food, you give them the best place in the house or in the tent, and you can imagine you give them also a wife for the night. But when Islam comes along, it says, well, you can't just do this. You've got to actually have a marriage ceremony. So you have a very quick marriage, and in the morning you say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and it's over. And the woman can go back to her original husband who divorced her for the night. It's legal. In Islam, of course, you have to have 9 months or a certain number of months to make sure the woman isn't pregnant from that temporary marriage before you remarry her, but you just remarry her. And if that was happening in Moses' time, this would be the exact way in which they would stop it.
Right, they would stop it. Yeah.
If a man divorces his wife and someone else marries her, then the man can't then go and remarry his wife. That's an abomination before the Lord. And suddenly that language, that very religious language and very strong language, makes sense. He's pimping his wife.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. You do get the abomination language. It is religious language, but a lot of the cases are, that you find the term, you do have these sexual transgressions, that are in Leviticus and whatnot. So, I know you said it's a pet theory, but sure sounds good. It makes sense. But who knows if that's the case? But yeah, I could see how this would just stop it right in its tracks. So I understand why this has appeal, to you. All right. So you're sure you're not going to submit this for publication somewhere? Or?
Well, I'd love to find some corroboration in an ancient Persian text or something, but until I find that, it's really just a kite flying in the air.
All right. Well, you need a website then. You don't need peer review for the website. You just throw it out there. But it is interesting. All kidding aside, that it really would halt this with some immediacy. You'd be very, very. I don't know if you really loved your wife. I don't know anybody that would do this. They wouldn't incur the risk, and not being able to take her back again. Why would you do it? So again, that I can see where that has a lot of appeal. So we have Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. Again, the nature of it is somewhat nebulous as far as why the divorce occurs. But I think it's fair to say the important takeaway, again, for our discussion, really, and this is going to ripple out into other passages, both Old and New Testament. The important takeaway is that the woman who was given this certificate of divorce, whatever the cause was, the reason, she is allowed to remarry. Okay, that much is clear. So how does this relate to what we see later on in the Old Testament, like when we get into the prophets? Because when you talk divorce and remarriage, somebody's going to bring up the prophets, and they're going to find the verse that says God hates divorce, and then they're going to there's this language about God divorcing Israel and so on and so forth. So how does this Torah information in its context relate to what we see in the prophets?
Well, it's directly related to what we see in Jeremiah, because Jeremiah sees God divorcing Israel and is got a complete angst about this because he knows he can't remarry Israel, because Deuteronomy 24 says that you can't. Mm-hmm. So in Jeremiah 3 and 4, that this is a big, big topic. Of course, the main subject of Jeremiah there is that God has divorced Israel and he's about to divorce Judah, and Judah had better turn round and make sure that doesn't happen. That's what he's using it to warn her about. But he says here at the beginning of Jeremiah 3, if a man divorces his wife and she goes from him and becomes another's wife, will he return to her? Would not the land be greatly polluted? It's exactly the language of Deuteronomy 24, so that's clearly in his mind.
So does this mean that God's a polygamist? He's married Israel and Judah. How do you handle that language?
Well, of course, in the Old Testament, it wasn't wrong to have more than one wife, but God didn't set out to be a polygamist. It's just his wife turned into two.
Right. Right. So that's probably not going to happen.
Well, I've just been watching Altered Carbon, on Netflix.
Okay.
And you have this concept that you can be double sleeved. You can put yourself in two bodies. So maybe it will happen.
Yeah, somebody will figure out a way to do that. Yeah. So we have the case of Jeremiah. What about some of the other prophets? I mean, is it, let's divide it up into a couple questions. So is it proper to say that God divorced Israel? What would the grounds be? In other words, does this terminology, does it apply, or how does it apply to the question of individual divorce and remarriage? And then why does God say, I hate divorce? Put that together for us.
Well, certainly Jeremiah does talk about God divorcing Israel and separating from Judah with the danger of divorcing her. And so does Isaiah. Isaiah says, well, where's your mother's divorce certificate? It refers to the divorce certificate of Israel. Mm-hmm. And they are talking about God as being married to Israel, and because of her adulteries and things, he divorces her. And Ezekiel goes into details exactly what the reasons are for that divorce. He doesn't just talk about the idolatry as adultery, which all the prophets seem to talk about. He also says, well, look, I gave you food and you gave it to the idols. I gave you clothing and you gave it to the idols. Mm-hmm. I gave you love and you loved the idols instead. And all the grounds for divorce which are in the Old Testament, including those three which we haven't looked at yet, are cited for God's divorce in Ezekiel. And
well, let's pick that up, because you right there is the list. These are common things, common stipulations. Again, let's use the legal language here. Common stipulations that are part of the marriage contract. And so when the stipulations are not met, you have legitimate grounds for divorce. So what are the stipulations? You just mentioned a few of those, and then how they show up in the prophets.
Yeah, we find them in Exodus, in the covenants, in Exodus 21. You have the obligations to the very lowest form of wife. That's a slave that you've decided to marry. Mm-hmm. And if you decide you don't want to be married to her anymore, you have to, if you decide you're going to take a second wife and then you sort of neglect the first wife, who was the slave wife, you still have obligations to her. And it lists those obligations in verse 10. If he takes another wife, you cannot diminish her food or her clothing or her marital rights. That last word is difficult to translate, but marital rights is probably it's as good as any. So food, clothing, and marital rights. And those are the obligations that a man has to his wife. And if they are, and it says, if he does not do those three things for her, she can go out for nothing without payment of money. She's free from that marriage. And even though she came as a slave, she's absolutely free, and that there's nothing to pay or anything.
Right. She doesn't have to pay him.
Yes.
There's no cost to her. Yeah.
She doesn't have to buy her freedom. She's completely free because he hasn't fulfilled her obligations in marriage. And the rabbis quite sensibly took that as the minimum things that you have to give to your wife in marriage: food, clothing, and marital rights. And, of course, faithfulness, which they got from Deuteronomy.
All right. So if a woman says, to whatever the local, legal authorities or the rabbis, again, however we want to characterize that, look, my husband is not giving me enough food or clothing or marital rights. I know in your book you talk about the possibility this could be referring to conjugal rights. But any one of those things, again, whatever they were, and if the whole case is examined, and she's right, she is being deprived of whatever this thing is, or one of these clear things, then she is allowed to leave. In other words, that those are legitimate grounds for divorce, correct? Are we reading that correctly?
Correct. And also the other way around. A man could say that the woman is not cooking the food and she's not sewing together the cloth into clothes, and she's not reciprocating marital rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, you could. This is the bare minimum. Again, like you said, we do have these things listed in Exodus. It gets the same language gets picked up in the prophets to talk about the legitimacy of divorce, and right away, we've already sort of moved beyond what how divorce and remarriage typically get talked about in the church. It's usually only one of those, the conjugal rights, if we're reading that correctly, and specifically there's like an unfaithfulness situation or adultery. But in Exodus here, this would have been a legitimate divorce if she or he is being deprived of one of these other things.
Yeah, we tend to see these verses as obscure, hidden away in a part of the Bible we don't often read, and who knows about it. But in the first century marriage contracts that we have, they're found on Masada and in the Judean caves, along with Dead Sea Scrolls and things. In every marriage certificate which this part of it is preserved, you find this verse being quoted. And it says, you must not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. It was written into a piece of paper that every Jewish bride owned and kept safe, because that was her ticket to freedom if the marriage went wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And to remarriage.
Oh, yeah.
She wasn't just stuck, So, again, just that, and the fact that if it's written into these marriage certificates the marriage certificates, and of course the reverse, the divorce certificate, I'm sure you're going to get some of this. That tells you that it's not these Exodus verses, which seem peripheral to us, were not peripheral. I mean, this is how they're reading it. They're serious.
Yeah, we see it with the Babathra documents. That's a woman who was on the Mount Masada, ready to give her life with everyone else. She had a packet of documents, her family documents, and it was marriage documents were the most valuable pieces of paper that you owned. Forget about your social security number. It's your marriage documents, which is going to be that save you and give you an income when that horrible man ditches you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how does this relate to Hosea? I mean, because that's always at the forefront, and of any of these discussions, and there, because of the nature of the story and Gomer, again, our mind sort of defaults to the sexual infidelities, and we never really get to Exodus 21. But I mean, we have to bring Hosea into the discussion. So how is that a factor as well?
It's a lovely story, isn't it? And no, I don't mean that facetiously. I know because of the sacrifice involved and all. Yeah. Yeah. What's that movie where he goes and marries his prostitute, his mistress?
Is that Pretty Woman?
That's it, Pretty Woman. Yeah, it's such a moving story.
I've seen parts of that, but that was a good guess on my part. So.
Oh, very good, very good. And this is the Pretty Woman of the Old Testament, if you like, where he has to go and marry this whore, this prostitute, and he has to love her, because that illustrates how fanatically in love God was with Israel, even though she was going through all these men, all these idols, and being unfaithful under every tree on every hill. And yet God still loved her and was determined to bring her back. And although I say that Jeremiah is stuck because of Deuteronomy 24, he does find a way around. What Jeremiah says is, it's okay, because Israel and Judah are going to come back together again and be bound as one stick, be one people again, and therefore that she can be married again because Judah herself wasn't actually divorced. And Isaiah, he has a completely different solution to the same problem. He says, well, clearly, Israel is divorced, but no, it doesn't matter. they're going to be reborn as a new bride. And he says a newly virgin bride.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a wonderful image. But whatever, they can see that God is going to be so fanatically in love with Israel that he will find a way to get round these laws and get back together again with his beloved. And somehow he's going to win her over. And that we don't see the solution to until you get to the New Testament. We just can't see how God is going to win this love affair.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how did the this is the gist of the Old Testament material. God's situation with Israel, the split there with Israel and Judah, some of that divorce language. We've got essentially the lesson of Hosea is that God is committed, to the relationship. I know that there are some passages that you could legitimately read as though that God got divorced to Israel, like you just said, but he has a plan to reverse the situation in something that's totally innovative and new. Could we say that God was sort of forced into that decision, but again has this backup plan? Is that fair to throw that in the mix as well?
Yeah, it comes to a point where just continuing is just multiplying sin. Israel wasn't going to turn around. She wasn't going to change anything. And there's nothing but a decent man could do except end it. We find in Malachi, God hates divorce. And hey, have you ever met a divorcee who doesn't?
Yeah, and again, even though you have that situation, God hates it. This isn't going to change. So we're going to go through with this. It's not that his hands were tied, but that's where all of the circumstances are driving this decision. It's not something that God wants, but like you said, this is what a decent husband would do. But God still has a commitment through all that, again shown in the book of Hosea, that somehow, again supernaturally or in a totally unexpected way, this is going to come full circle and be reversed somehow. And we can already see that how some of that, would apply, to our own, marital situations, in principle, perhaps, maybe even, all of it, maybe not in this lifetime, especially if there's a divorce between believers and, there might be a sort of a hopeless situation. But, what I'm getting at here is sort of leading up to a question, how much, and we'll hit this when we talk New Testament, but I'm going to throw it out here anyway, because I'm going to turn it back into the Second Temple community. But how much of this can we really use analogically to our human marital relationships? I mean, how much of it really applies, and in what way would it apply? So that is a thought that we're going to have to take into the New Testament, but I'll just leave it here in the Second Temple period. Obviously, people get married. They run into problems. They know that this information is in their sacred texts. So how did they do this? Like, how did they apply these passages? And again, some of them are pretty nebulous. They're not clear. They don't have the precision we'd want. What were the schools of thought in the religious community in the Second Temple period for applying all this stuff? How'd they do it?
Well, we have the writings of lawyers and how the lawyers applied it. I think even for us, the Old Testament is important in that we see God as a divorcee. And there's so many divorcees in churches who are just rejected because they might be completely the innocent partner, but because they're a divorcee, they can't be an elder, say, or they can't even be a member in some churches. And we have to always remind ourselves, well, being a divorcee isn't necessarily a bad thing. God was a divorcee. And you're not going to let God be an elder in your church?
Yeah, well, again, it sounds silly, but honestly, if you're going to press one passage into service to answer an ethical question, okay, or bring it up to interpret what Paul says about the qualification for elders, if you're going to do that with one Old Testament passage, on what grounds do you exclude others? So I do I tend to agree there's a method question here that often gets avoided in the discussion. How consistent are we, in taking the Old Testament instead of just using it to angle for the position we've already sort of decided we're going to land on. How consistent is that really? I think that's a good question that we need to ask ourselves. And you're obviously, doing it now, and you've done it in the book. So can you elaborate on that a little bit? Just in terms of method, how might we do it? How did they do it in the Jewish community?
The Jewish community, we have to divide in half at the point of 70 AD, because that's when Judaism came together as one community and followed one halakha, as they called it, one way, one interpretation of the law. Before that, there were many, many different schools who had differing viewpoints. And although they were fairly agreed on marriage things, that there was a very big division on divorce. But the principle that everyone followed was that a marriage stayed together and couldn't be broken unless someone broke a vow, broke one of the stipulations in the contract, if you like, and then a divorce could happen. So if someone didn't, that was unfaithful, or if someone didn't supply the food and clothing, or if someone wouldn't take part in conjugal relations, then a divorce was possible. But until one of those stipulations was broken, the marriage couldn't be ended.
If you just think about that, if you didn't have a legitimate out, then what you're saying is, well, you have to stay in this contract even though the other person broke it. It doesn't, it seems, when you think about it just in contractual terms, that seems pretty odd.
There is one situation in the Old Testament where that's the case.
Okay.
If you rape a woman,
all right,
then you have to marry her and you can never divorce her.
Mm-hmm. So there you got crime and punishment. Yeah.
Yeah, she can be as horrible to you as she likes for the rest of your life, and you've got to take it.
And chances are she would.
I guess.
Because of the circumstance, chances are good if she was, if there was no way to, get out of that.
It wasn't compulsory. It was
right.
Up to the father, and presumably the father would listen to the daughter. Mm-hmm. But it was one way that she would be supported for the rest of her life, and she would not have to do what he said. So it's not ideal, but it's not bad either.
What is the this will be our last question for anything that we would call sort of Old Testament leading up to the New, for the next episode. But we often hear about the Shammai and Hillel division in Judaism about divorce, and of course, that affects remarriage. So can you give us a sentence or two about that to sort of set up, or at least provide a segue when we get into the Gospels? Is it lawful for a man to divorce, his wife for any cause, and some of the different wordings we get there. So people in the audience are going to know that there was this division of opinion within the Jewish community about what was a legitimate cause for divorce. So give us a few sentences about that.
Yeah, well, we know both Hillelites and Shammaites accepted Exodus 21, because they both make regulations about what exactly, how much clothing, how much food, how much marital rights has to be given. So they both agreed that those were grounds for divorce. But the Hillelites, they were genius. They managed to find a ground for divorce in Deuteronomy 24, which they called something like any cause, an any cause ground for divorce. Because they said, well, it says here that this woman was divorced the first time for some indecency, or it's evat devar, which is a rather strange phrase. It means something like indecency of a thing, evat, nakedness, devar, a thing, a deed, a clause, a word. So indecency of a thing. And they said, well, look, this can be two things. Indecency, obviously, that means adultery. And then you got a thing.
So they took the two words and took them in two different directions.
Yeah, so they said they've got two grounds for divorce here. You got indecency and you got a thing, and it doesn't say what thing it is. So it's anything. Anything will do. If she burns a dinner, that's a thing. If she's got wrinkles that I didn't see when we got married, it's a thing. Anything will do.
So the Hillel school is the no-fault divorce.
Yeah, you don't have to find anything. No fault is what we call it.
Yeah, and the other school would say what?
Well, they were more traditional. They, as I said, they took Exodus 21 like the Hillelites did. But when they looked at Deuteronomy 24, they said, no, there's only one ground for divorce there. That's adultery. That's the only thing there. It's just a single phrase. If that divorce is just a single phrase, it's not two clauses. It's one clause. And there's nothing but adultery in Deuteronomy 24.
You know, like you said, isn't that clever? You know, there you have two words. What could be simpler? Well, yeah, two words mean two things, or two words equal a phrase that means one thing. And so the ramifications are quite dramatic. I mean, that's quite a difference.
Yeah, but you've got to stand on one side or the other. Mm-hmm. You've got to make a decision on this. And that's why they went to Jesus. And they said, well, what do you think? Does it mean one thing or does it mean two things? Yeah. Does it mean any cause, or what do you think?
Yeah. Well, that's a good place, to end. So I want to thank you for spending, this time with us with respect to what the Old Testament says. And when we have you back, we'll hit the New Testament. So thanks for being here.
It's great. Great talking to you.
Well, we're excited to have David Instone-Brewer back on the podcast. He was on the previous episode. We were talking about divorce and remarriage, and we focused on the Old Testament. So if you have not listened to that episode prior to this one, you really need to do that. So go back and listen to the previous episode with David. And we're going to jump into the New Testament in this episode. So, applying a number of things that we talked about in that first episode. So by all means, please go back and listen to that. But for people who might be new, that are not going to listen to what I just said, David, can you introduce yourself a little bit again for our audience?
Yep. I'm David Instone-Brewer. Forgive the long surname. I inherited it. I come from Cambridge in England, where I'm a research fellow at Tyndale House. It's absolutely the best place to do biblical research because we've got all the books that you could need. And if we don't actually have the book you need, there's a library around the corner with another 8 million. So, yeah, come to Tyndale House, come and meet me, come and have coffee.
Yeah, if you can't find what you're looking for with those resources, it's probably not important enough to be spending any time on it. Be a little bit too esoteric.
Yeah, the best thing, though, is the coffee time, because then everyone leaves their desks and they go and talk to each other, and all these Bible nerds all on hand. And, you've got an Akkadian phrase you can't make head and tail of. There'll be someone there who can turn it upside down and read it for you. So,
okay, yeah. I have to ask you a tea question, though. I mean, I actually don't drink coffee. I drink tea. You have to have tea there, right?
Of course we have tea. Okay. I remember one time... We tend to have coffee. We call it coffee in the morning and tea in the afternoon. And one time someone from Time magazine phoned. They wanted to interview me. Amazing. But the front office, they said, I'm very sorry, Dr. Instone-Brewer is drinking tea. He can't talk to you now.
Well, to me, that's an acceptable excuse. I'm a tea addict. So, that's what I'd be angling for right away. And I love... I don't want to get into the tea thing, but yeah, English breakfast tea and Scottish and Irish, man, I'm into all of it. So yeah, I just wanted to make sure if I'm ever over there, I don't want to be disappointed with coffee. I want tea. That's what I'm there for. Tea and books. I mean, what could be better? Well, let's jump into our second episode here. We've got, again, for those of you who didn't listen to the first one, David has spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, done a lot of writing. And again, I highly recommend his book on divorce and remarriage in the Bible, and also the similar title in the church, Divorce and Remarriage in the Church. These are great resources because they focus, especially the one about the Bible. Again, that's going to be the more academic of the two. Doesn't mean the other one's not, but you know what I mean. This is the title I'm sort of zeroing in on here. is a major resource that gets us into primary sources and, of course, good secondary peer-reviewed literature. And this is what we care about here. Really focusing on Scripture, taking Scripture in its own context, and paying close attention to the text. And so we talked about Old Testament a lot. We talked about Deuteronomy 24. We talked about marriage as a contract and how Deuteronomy 24 was really significant because it allowed women to divorce or to get divorced. If they were divorced by their husband, they have a certificate that says they can remarry. We talked a little bit about how God and His relationship with Israel factors into this, and we ended that hour by going back to Deuteronomy 24 with the Hillel and Shammai difference of opinion on Deuteronomy 24, and it's actually really simple. You had the Hillel school, essentially the no-fault divorcers, take the two-word phrase that in our English Bibles, in Deuteronomy 24, often gets translated indecency as being the cause. Let me go back and actually read that verse. When a man takes a wife and marries her, then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her. And then he writes her a certificate of divorce, so on and so forth. So there are two Hebrew words behind the ESV there, some indecency. One is, again, the indecency. It's related to the word for nakedness. And so the Hillel school said, well, that part, that word of those two refers to adultery. But then the other word there is davar, thing, okay? It's just a thing. It can be anything. And so David pointed out that this school took those two words, went two different directions, and so the causes for divorce could be adultery and really anything else. And then the Shammai school said, no, we have to keep those terms together. It's one phrase, and they interpreted that as marital infidelity. And so this is what takes us into the Gospels. The authorities there, the teachers, ask Jesus which side he is on. So David, take us into that scene in the Gospels where we have this situation, and what does this controversy contribute to our understanding of the Gospels and Jesus' response? Actually, he responds in more than one way, but take us into this scene. When they confront Jesus with this question, what are they trying to do, and how does Jesus initially respond?
Well, I guess everyone in Israel had to take an opinion on this because there'll be people in their families who were divorced or who were getting a divorce. And when you do that, you have to pick your lawyer carefully. On a case like that, you have three lawyers, three rabbis make up a court, and there'll be one from each school and another one. And if you don't pick them carefully, you're going to get the wrong decision. Mm-hmm. So that everyone knew about this difference on divorce, that the Hillelites let you get divorced for anything at all, and the Shammaites said, no, you can only get divorced for these four things which are actually stipulated in Scripture: for indecency, lack of food, lack of clothing, lack of conjugal rights.
Yeah, and those three, other than the infidelity, come from Exodus 21, correct?
Yes.
That's what everybody agreed on. It's just the Deuteronomy 24 is where they split off.
Yeah, we think of it as coming from Exodus 21, but any Jewish woman would think of it as coming from that piece of paper which she hoards so carefully, called her marriage contract, because it's written out there in black and white, quoting Exodus 21. So this was a really important text for them, along with Deuteronomy 24. But the difficulty was Deuteronomy 24. That's where the dispute lay. Do you accept that it also talks about divorce for anything, any cause? And so they come to Jesus and they actually ask him that. They say, is it lawful to get divorced for any cause? Now, of course, in Mark, it doesn't say that. In Mark, it just says, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Mm-hmm. Now, that's a weird phrase, because they could just answer that and say, duh, yes, because it says in the law you can divorce your wife.
Right.
And I think it's similar to when we say, is it lawful for an 18-year-old to drink? And we all know what it means.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But if an 18-year-old doesn't drink, they're going to die from dehydration.
Right. So we mentally, again, because of our familiarity with that example, we know what it means and what it doesn't mean. Our brain's going to fill in the gaps because we just know.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is the same thing in the New Testament period, first century, that, even though Mark words it differently, people are going to fill it in the way it needs to be filled in.
And Matthew does it for us. I suspect that Jesus, I suspect in the original question to Jesus, they didn't bother to fill it in because everyone knew the question. But by the time Matthew is writing his gospel, things have already moved on, and this is becoming the only form of divorce in the house that's divorce for any cause. And they don't realize that it's a question anymore. It's been settled.
All right. And now, this is an important observation. This isn't really a trivial thing, because what David is suggesting, and I think it's really, I would almost say self-evident. I mean, the original hearers of this and the readers are going to just know, again, what the real question is. They're going to have had experience. They're going to have this really certifiable intuition as to really what's going on here. So we should not today. We shouldn't take the difference in wording and sort of try to make, either create a contradiction or again have some sort of self-styled interpretation that pits these things against each other. That would be really an incorrect method. It'd be a very poor hermeneutic.
And it's kind of confirmed by the fact that without that extra clause, the question is as meaningless as, is it lawful for an 18-year-old to drink?
Right.
It just doesn't make sense without mentally adding for any cause or alcoholic beverages.
So what does Jesus do with it? What does he do with the question?
He avoids it. He's not interested in talking about divorce at all, because he goes off on this long digression. He goes off to say about marriage. It is made for male and female, one male and one female, and I didn't ask you about that.
Right. They get a lecture on what marriage should be instead of an answer to the question. Yeah.
And you should be leaving your wife and you're becoming one flesh, and you shouldn't be getting divorced. Yeah. We know we shouldn't be getting divorced, but Moses said we could. Come on, get back to it. And he's going through a whole host of issues there. He's contradicting the Jewish teaching on polygamy. He contradicts the Jewish teaching on that you should get divorced if there's adultery. He says, no, God only said that you could. And he's saying that he's later contradicts the idea that you had to get married because the first law in Scripture is go forth and multiply. Mm-hmm. And Jesus says, no, you can be like the eunuchs. You don't have to marry.
Right. Yeah. So he's contradicting pretty much everything in sight. But Jesus spent some time on it, so we should spend some time on it too. So tell us how his rabbit trail, Jesus' rabbit trail, contradicts what, I guess it's fair to say a number of people of his time would have thought about polygamy. So how does it do that?
It doesn't make sense until you're familiar with the way in which the Jews were already talking about this. At Qumran, there's in the Damascus document, you've got a series of proof texts to show that polygamy is wrong. They thought that the people who went off to live at Qumran separated themselves from other Jews. They thought you should only have one wife. Of course, you had to have a wife, if only for a short period, but only have one. And they said, here's the proof. Adam and Eve, they get married, male and female, it says. And then when you look at that exactly the same phrase later in the story of the flood, it says they went into the ark 2 by 2, male and female. Therefore, male and females, only 2 involved. Only one man, one wife, not lots of wives. And Jesus quotes 2 of those proof texts that they come up with about the male and female, and everyone can put in the third one. They know this is the general argument against polygamy.
So when Jesus does this, again, basically sounding like some of these Qumran verdicts, these opinions,
but he also
people are going to know what he's thinking here.
Yeah, he also uses an argument that's used by the diaspora Jews. All the translations of the Old Testament from Hebrew, the one into Syriac and into Old Greek and the early ones into Latin, all the old translations, they all add a word to the Genesis quote. When Jesus quotes, and the two shall become one flesh, he's added a word to the text. Therefore, a man will leave his mother and father and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Now, you probably know which word he's added.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's the word two. The word two isn't in any Hebrew manuscript. And no Jew is going to be fooled by that, but they know that this is the normal way. In the Targum, when they read out the Aramaic version of the Old Testament, they will add that word two. They always add the word two because the diaspora Jews were very keen to say, hey, we shouldn't really be having more than one wife. There's only two people who become one flesh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Jesus is fully on board with other Jews who are saying there shouldn't be polygamy.
And so, again, his rabbit trail, how does that address the other two things that you brought up that you, trying to remember exactly how you worded this, but that, I'll let you fill in the blank. So there were two other things that it contradicts.
The Jews also believed that you had to divorce someone if there was adultery. If your wife committed adultery, you had to divorce her.
It's an obligation.
Obligation of decency. And that's why in Matthew you have, why did Moses command one to give a divorce certificate and send her away? But Jesus says, no, hang on. He allowed you to divorce your wives. Allowed, not commanded. And the other thing is just divorce itself. It was so easy. It was so normal. And it was regarded as a decent thing to do in a lot of circumstances. But Jesus didn't like the idea of divorce at all. And so he says, no, there's only divorce if there's hardness of heart. Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. And that's hardness of heart. That's cardioscleroma. So that describes rather like blood vessels which get hard. But it was an invented word in the Septuagint, and it only occurs twice, and both times, only once in the context of divorce. That's in Jeremiah 4:4, where God is divorcing Israel for her hardness of heart.
And so that would be directed at just her, basically her persistence, in infidelity, to the other gods and whatnot. So do you think that's what Jesus was angling for? Like when he said it's because of the hardness of your hearts, was he referring to just the women or the men? Everybody. I mean, what do you think he's thinking there?
I think he's pointing out how much God will put up with sin in a marriage before he got divorced. Mm-hmm. Israel was such a terrible wife, committing adultery with so many other lovers. And yet God delayed and delayed and delayed at divorce, and then eventually did divorce her. And it's, as Jesus said, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. Sometimes it just gets so terrible, so bad, there is no other way forward. It just has to end in divorce. And,
right. So it's not like siding with one party or the other. It's just sort of a general statement that, again, sometimes it's just so bad, this happens.
We are a sinful species, and God knew that there had to be some way in which to end the marriage, because, hey, you get these abusive marriages, which are just dangerous to be in. Mm-hmm. And there has to be an exit door, not because God wants us to sin, and not because God wants us to end marriages, but because we do sin, and we do kill marriages, and there has to be a way in which to end it because of our own sin.
Do you think that when Jesus gets into this, let's just do it this way. You have this, the Hillel Shammai debate, and basically Jesus has sidestepped that initially, and then he gets drawn back into, just as you outlined there. Well, we didn't want to lecture on marriage. We want to know what side of this you're on. Has what you said to this point, do you think, is that the best way that you would, put sort of what Jesus does, where he lands, or does he land more firmly on one side or the other?
He lands on one side in terms of Hillel and Shammai, but clearly he's not that interested in divorce. He's more interested in marriage. I have this friend.
Right. He's not going to parse all the causes, and these are non-causes, and this is legit, that's not legit. I mean, he's not getting into he's not playing the lawyer game.
No, he wants to say, look, you're supposed to stay together forever. God is one of your witnesses at the wedding. Come on. And, okay, there's some bad things in your marriage, but it's only when there's real hardness of heart that's why Moses allowed a divorce certificate. You don't divorce for small things. It's got to be a big thing. And so, he's for marriage. He's for keeping people together. But he recognizes, there are times when that hardness of heart is so terrible, you just need that divorce.
Where else does the conversation go? Because you've got, this, Jesus finally, comes around to, telegraphing, where he's at, just as you, summarized there. What about the remarriage question? I mean, that becomes part of this discussion. So can you set that up, for us? I mean, how does this become part of the conversation, and what does Jesus do with it?
We have a certain problem in the way in which Jesus summarizes his teaching. He's been asked about this any cause in Deuteronomy 24. As you know, Matthew also adds another phrase, which you don't find in Mark, which is except for adultery. Getting divorced for any cause, that was the slogan that the Hillelites had. From Deuteronomy 24, you get divorced for any cause. And the Shammaites, they answered, no, that verse is talking about nothing except adultery. It isn't talking about adultery and any cause. It's only talking about adultery. And that's what Jesus answers with. The only way you can get divorced on Deuteronomy 24 is except for adultery. And if you've done it for anything else, any cause, and then you remarry someone else, you're committing adultery. That sounds a bit strange at first, because you think, well, how can you be committing adultery by remarrying? Well, of course, you're still married to the first person you were married to. It's an invalid divorce if you're using the Hillelite interpretation. So you're still married to the first person. You get remarried, you're committing adultery against your first wife or your first husband. That's where the adultery comes in. But he's not saying remarriage is wrong. He's saying remarriage for after a divorce for any cause is wrong, because you're not properly divorced. You haven't got divorced on biblical grounds.
How do you think that how would that work out? I mean, for those who went ahead and did what I asked them to do, they've listened to the first part, or again are taking these consecutively anyway. I mean, you are, you're a pastor as well. You're not just a scholar. You've had plenty of church experience. How do you take that information? And we haven't even gotten to Paul yet, but I'll ask it here. If you want to defer it to Paul, we can wait for this. But on a practical level, how do you talk to people, who are, in this situation where, okay, I was in this marriage and we got divorced for any cause. It was something stupid or, again, one of these no fault things. And now I'm remarried. So what do I do now? So how do you apply, sort of the spirit of the law or the letter of the law? How do you do that here?
I think I am going to have to drag you into Paul for that.
Okay, because, let's go with Paul.
Okay, in 1 Corinthians 7, he deals with a couple exactly like that.
Mm-hmm.
And there he says, throughout 1 Corinthians 7, he sort of deals with men and women equally. And he says, a man does this and a woman does, a man does it. But in verse 10 and 11, suddenly we're talking about a man and a woman separately. And I think we're talking about an actual case which happened there, where a woman left her husband, and that means in Roman terms you're divorced. A divorce was enacted as soon as you left your spouse with the intention of divorcing. That was it. So she's divorced her husband effectively by walking out. And Paul says to her, she must not do that. And seeing she has done it, she's got to remain unmarried and try and be reconciled to her husband. So she's walked out for no good reason. And he says, well, you've got to try for reconciliation.
What do you think? I mean, because if we look at 1 Corinthians 7, 10 and 11, I mean, it is kind of obvious that this is a divorce. I mean, the wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, okay, she should remain unmarried, okay, or else be reconciled to her husband. The term unmarried there, I believe, occurs 4 times in the passage, and I don't think it occurs anywhere else other than this discussion of Paul in 1 Corinthians 7. So do you think, this is just kind of out of left field, but it's something I've wondered. One of these situations, when you get to later in the letter, he says it like around verse 25, not concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Don't seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. Can we say the status of being free from a wife is unmarried? In other words, free from a wife could be never married at all. If you're divorced, are you free from a wife because you're no longer married? And the reason the question is important because of the next verse. If you do marry, okay, then you've not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. So on and so forth. So how do you get Paul to be consistent here? How do you navigate the unmarried terminology in light of verses 10 and 11?
Yeah, I don't think we can make conclusions that the unmarried in verse 34 therefore means that they had been married, and this is an unmarried person getting remarried. I know that's one way in which people try and argue, yes, Paul's okay with getting remarried. They don't. It's not necessary to argue that way, and it's certainly not safe to argue that way, because, as you say, the term's only being used those 4 times, and it's difficult to make a definition from 4 occurrences, especially as they're rather different contexts. But I would agree that Paul does allow people to remarry, but just not from that verse.
Why don't you unpack that a little bit about Paul's thoughts on remarriage?
The reason he's telling her not to remarry in verse 11, the woman has walked out, is because as soon as she does, then the reconciliation isn't possible. You can't be reconciled with her husband having married someone else. So that's the importance of not getting married to someone else in the meantime. It's not a sort of eternally you can't get remarried. It's you're not getting remarried in order to attempt reconciliation. Of course, her husband might turn around and say, yeah, you left me. Clearly, you don't want to be with me. You've abandoned me in Jewish biblical terms. You're not providing food, clothing, love. That the marriage is over, and it's up to him to say that because he's the victim. Only the victim can say, yes, I'm going to go for that divorce. And
so it sounds like what you're saying here is that, and I think this is consistent with a couple of things you said in the Old Testament treatment, that let's say that the wife is a victim. You have a scenario where you have someone who didn't want a divorce, and then their spouse divorces them, and it's not, for, infidelity. It's again one of these no fault things. But here you have the innocent party. So Paul, isn't, telling that person that from here to eternity you can't get remarried. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, that you're staying unmarried so that you can be reconciled. He doesn't say how long you have to stay unmarried, but presumably, if the husband says there's no way, then there isn't any barrier to her not getting married.
So really, the guts of verses 10 and 11, as you're reading them, is Paul's saying, "Give it a chance." it's kind of like a hierarchy of preferences here. If all things being equal, be reconciled.
Well, it's also not her decision, because
in that case, it wouldn't be her decision.
It's his decision, and he has to say no, that the reconciliation isn't happening, and then it really is over. But until that happens, she's supposed to try to get back together again.
Do you think Paul and Jesus? There's obviously a big discussion. It goes a lot of different directions. Paul and Jesus, are they on the same page, the same paragraph, different pages? How do you look at the relationship between what Jesus is saying and what Paul is saying?
Well, it is very difficult by the traditional interpretation, which doesn't take into account this legal terminology, because if Jesus is saying there's only one ground for divorce, and that's adultery, and then Paul comes along and says, oh, no, there's only one ground for divorce, and that's abandonment. Well, they're just plain contradicting each other.
Mm-hmm. So you would think that they're probably, again, just for lack of a better way of putting it, they have something really specific in their heads at the time they're talking about this. Do you think that's fair?
Well, Jesus has something very specific in his mind because he's being asked about it. He's being asked about this any cause divorce and being asked, do you agree with it? And he says, no, if you get divorced on that ground, you're not properly divorced. And if you think you're getting remarried, well, actually, you're committing adultery, because that isn't a biblical ground.
Is he speaking to the decision maker, the one doing the divorcing, or both parties?
Well, whoever is getting remarried, both partners are still married to each other, because it's an invalid divorce.
Right.
He's
so
speaking to them both.
Yeah, they would still be married. Yeah. Yeah. So why do you think Paul feels, or Paul goes the direction he does? Is he just trying to do the best he can with the situation at hand, or is there something else going on here?
Paul is sticking to Old Testament law. By Old Testament law, the only grounds for divorce are adultery, not providing food and clothing, and not providing love. And in 1 Corinthians 7, he says in verse 3 and 4 about the obligations to provide, to have marital love, to allow for marital love. And then in verse 35 and whatever, he's saying about the concerns for, the worldly concerns that we often think about it, but the very practical concerns in marriage. There's an obligation to look after your husband, look after your wife, which, of course, in biblical grounds for divorce is food and clothing. So he's recognizing all those three obligations. He's not talking about them as grounds for divorce. He's recognizing them as obligations within marriage. So he seems to be basing his theology on the Old Testament, like Jesus does. And
since he wants those things to happen, that's why he's arguing for reconciliation.
Well, the reconciliation, because there hasn't been a ground for divorce. Okay. There's been no biblical ground for divorce, so you shouldn't be walking away. You've got no grounds, come back. Mm-hmm. But when he talks in verse 15 to the people who actually have been left, he says, well, you've been left. This person isn't going to come back. They're certainly not going to come back because I'm going to tell them to come back, because they're not believers. Mm-hmm. And so you are now free. When he says they're free, he doesn't mean they're free to get divorced, because they already are divorced. Mm-hmm. If someone's walked out on you, you are divorced in Roman law. So the freedom there is the freedom to remarry.
Mm. Yeah, that the way you said that really does. It's going to sound maybe a little odd, but it has the flavoring of Deuteronomy 24 to my ear. That there's this, sort of taking it for what it is, and granted, there's no exchange of a bill of divorcement here, but it seems like the spirit is kind of the same. Is that fair to say?
It's legalistic. We're not being nice in these marriages anymore now. We're looking at the law. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so Deuteronomy 24 in that sense. But we also have to bear in mind the sort of world that they're living in. In the Roman world, the law said you had to be married, effectively, if you're a Roman citizen. the Julia came in, I think, 4 BC, which was to try and get more Roman citizens by making Roman citizens have babies. And they said, look, if you're not married, you should get married. If you are get divorced, you've got to get remarried within 12 months, I think it was. And if you're a widow or widower, you have to get remarried within 18 months. It's a pretty strict law.
Wow.
And the Christians lived under this like the Romans did. If you didn't follow it, then your neighbor can snoop on you and can take you to court and say this person has been divorced for over a year and they haven't remarried yet, and he would be rewarded with half their goods. So you.
I didn't know that. That's crazy, boy.
Yeah. But it was almost the same in Judaism because the very first law was that you should go forth and multiply. If you got divorced, you should remarry and have children. And the rabbis actually asked themselves, well, how many children do we need to have before we're released from this?
Right.
And one rabbi says, well, you've got to have 2 children. Another one says, well, you've got to have 2 boys. And then he says it's because Moses had 2 boys, so we obviously have to have 2 boys. But the other rabbi said, no, it's only a boy and a girl will do because that's what God had.
Oh, boy.
But they argued about this because it was serious.
That should be a skit. That really should be a skit.
And Ben Azzi, he was presumably already married, but his wife died or divorced or something. They kept asking him, when are you going to get remarried? Because, the law says you've got to marry. And he eventually answers, well, I'm married to Torah. He had a get-out clause.
Right.
But the expectation was if you got divorced, you remarried because you had to make sure you have these children in both Judaism and in Roman society. So now imagine that Paul wanted to teach that Christians could not remarry. He would have to say it very clearly. He'd have to say, I know you're risking your litigation. I know you're risking being looked down on by all your fellow Jews, but you must not remarry. He could have said that. But he would have had to say it very clearly because everything else said you have to remarry.
Mm-hmm. So your point is that he doesn't say it with that kind of force. Is that what
he doesn't say it with any force at all. He just doesn't talk about it. He doesn't say remarriage is permitted. He doesn't say it's not allowed. It's
really interesting, because Paul this is the same guy, that the Romans 13, the powers that be are ordained of God, and living peaceably under the law and all that sort of stuff. That would be a delicate thing, a delicate dance.
Yeah, but on this issue, he doesn't have to be against the law with it. In the Old Testament, remarriage is clearly allowed if you've got a proper divorce. Jesus didn't say remarriage wasn't allowed with a proper divorce. He said it wasn't allowed with an improper divorce. So there's no problem that he's facing. The only problem that we have is that when we read Jesus, we don't know the legal terminology, and we think he's disallowing all divorces. And therefore, of course, there's no remarriage.
Well, your book's last 2 chapters deal with modern discussions of divorce and remarriage and pastoral concerns. The modern discussions chapter is sort of a rundown on, different ways that the subject matter has been approached within the church, different traditions and whatnot, and then, the whole chapter on pastoral concerns. So what I'd like to do is take, again, what you've talked about in both the last episode and this episode, and sort of get your take on how you would address certain things as a pastor. Just talking to people, the advice that you might give them or the direction. The example I'll use, I guess I'll start with this one. I've gotten this question 4 or 5 times in email, and I think in all but one case, the person when they were divorced, they were not a believer, and then they became a believer later, but they were already remarried, and so they don't believe that they were divorced for a biblically allowable reason. And so the question is, in all these cases, am I living in perpetual adultery? What should I do? So I'm sure you've gotten that in the past. So how do you try to address that? What's the conversation that you might have with somebody who is in that situation?
Yeah, there seems to be a belief that the wrongful divorce is the unforgivable sin.
Yeah, the divorce the sin that keeps on taking. Yeah.
Yeah, but it really isn't, because God takes our contrition and turns it into forgiveness, and therefore anything. But what
so are you suggesting do? Are you suggesting it's a matter of the heart?
No. I'm thinking, what should be the practical approach?
Okay.
If they then turn to their second spouse and say, I'm going to divorce you in order to remarry my first spouse, who perhaps has got married in the meantime anyway, and so they're going to divorce their spouse, you're multiplying sin in order to make something right in the past. And as our grandmothers will have told us, two wrongs don't make a right.
Mm-hmm.
Breaking your vows to your present spouse in order to make up for the vows that you broke to your former spouse, that doesn't make right anything.
Right.
Just makes more victims.
And you couldn't withhold conjugal relations either, because that would be also breaking your vow.
Correct. So you have to say, well, that was in the past. Please, God, forgive me, and help me not to do that again. Help me not to break my marriage vows again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and honestly, I hate to say it, but there are going to be some out there that this sounds too simplistic for them, and but you got to trust God. I mean, honestly, you have to trust that God knows the situation, and He does forgive you.
Yeah, well, this should never have happened, but then nor should the fall have happened. There are many things that should never have happened. And so God, fortunately, is a forgiving God, unlike all the others in the Old Testament. God actually forgives us when we repent to Him. Mm-hmm. And we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Now, I'll ask you this one. I think you did hint at this already, actually more than hint, because I think you did say this when we talked about Jesus. And I also think, that you might have said something about it in the first episode, but this question. Again, so this will be a little bit repetitive, but someone comes into your office as a pastor and say, my spouse is committing adultery, and I believe I must divorce them. Your answer?
How many times did God forgive Israel? One reason for the 7 times 70 that Jesus brought up, the number of times you have to forgive someone who sins against you, is that's how many times Israel didn't keep the laws of the Sabbath year, and the number of years that she rebelled against God, 7 times 70, and God still didn't divorce her until that 7 times 70 times. So no one from the outside of a marriage can say when something is too bad, but the role of the pastor is always to say, can I help you? Can I help support your marriage? And can the church help you to give support to you? And the role of the pastor is never to say, yeah, obviously now's the time you've got to divorce her. Now's the time you've got to end the marriage to him. That's the wrong message. The right message is always support. But when it is too far, and the person in the marriage will know that, then you have to say, well, yeah, I'm going to support you in that too.
Mm-hmm. Another one. And I've gotten 1 or 2 of these, and I'm sure as a pastor you've gotten this more often. But I'm in an abusive relationship. I'm fearful. My husband beats me or hits me, and I'm a Christian. He's not, or even if he claims to be, even if he is, I'm really afraid that he could kill me or really do serious damage to me. What should I do? How would you approach that person?
Yeah, I would always go for safety. physical abuse is a big no-no. When the rabbis talked about abuse, they weren't talking about anything like that. In the law, it's just simple neglect. Even if it's not giving you enough food or enough clothing, then that's a ground for divorce. Physical abuse is so far down the road away from that. Divorce should probably have been considered long before that. And unfortunately, people get into this relationship where they just take it. And there's a guy from New Zealand who came over to film me and find out about what I wanted, what I was saying in the divorce book. He's the one who made the Playmobil presentation of the divorce book, a wonderful thing on the internet. But he started because in his church there was a couple, and she was saying, look, he beats me and I should divorce him surely. And the elders said, no, you've got to go back to him. And one day she was hanging up washing and he came out with his gun and just shot her. And I would work on safety and say, if it's got to a point of physical abuse, you really shouldn't be in the same house.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I would certainly agree with that. Last question, in your experience, I guess we'll make this two questions. What is the most rewarding thing that someone has come to you with or has said about your work in this area? And then also, what's the most grievous thing, like where you just heard what a person said and had to think to yourself, or maybe you said it out loud, you're just making the whole situation worse? I mean, what's your experience been? Polar opposites there.
Yeah, I've had almost nothing but good experiences. When I was first thinking of writing on this subject, I seriously considered writing under a pseudonym because I knew that I was going against what everyone else was saying. And I was reading the Bible through the eyes of the rabbis because I'd just done a PhD where I'd read pretty much everything the rabbis had ever said. And I could see the New Testament was talking in their language, and I could see it made sense. But I seriously considered not putting my head above the parapet, so to speak, because I was going to get shot at. And yet I've been received very well. And the two other main voices on the divorce in the Protestant world, that's Bill Heth and Keener, they both are saying the same thing now, based on the same evidence I've brought up. So it's been very well received. But at any time I go to a conference, I went to a Baptist ministers' conference just a couple of days ago. Someone came and said, I must thank you that in my family, my mother was able to go to my sister's marriage because she was divorced, and my mother wasn't going to go because she believed that no Christian can get remarried. And thanks to your book, they were able to go, and we brought the family together. Thank you so much. And I get that pretty much any time I meet people. Mm. It's really affirming. And so I'm so glad I put my name on the book.
Any really, over here we would call them facepalm moments, like, I can't believe I'm hearing this. If you don't have any, that's great. It's just that when you are a scholar and you write something and you write intentionally, for the average person in the pew, and this is certainly a subject that is going to go that direction, and intentionally so. Sometimes you get really misunderstood. Have you had any of that happen?
Okay, yes, there was a time when I was very badly misunderstood when I wrote for Christianity Today, and they have such I had to write such a short article covering this huge area, and I used some bad terminology, and I got slated by people, and I just had to answer them gracefully, said, I didn't mean that. You've read my book. Mm-hmm. And that sort of misunderstanding is bad, but these are very minor things, and I've been dealt such an easy hand. It's great, and I was looking round at my own family a few months ago when we had a christening. And I'm a Baptist, but not everyone in my family is a Baptist, so they were getting their baby done,
Sure.
And so everyone in the family was there. They're filling this big sports club. And there was no one there who's divorced. I think we must be the last family on earth without a divorce in the family. The point is, I didn't do this because of a member in my family is divorced. And I was trying to, got to find the evidence to make it okay. I was just looking at it because I was a Baptist minister and people kept knocking on my door and saying, can I get married in your church? Because this church down the road won't marry me. And so I had to look at it, and I did it in a dispassionate way. But yeah, it wasn't to fix anything. And I pray that we will never have to face divorce in our family ever.
Well, thank you again for being with us. Again, I highly recommend the books. Again, it's very good to get, to read something again that really not only makes an effort, but is quite successful at orienting a scriptural topic or discussion, in its wider context. Again, we value, primary sources here and the enterprise of reading scripture, in its own ancient contexts. And so this is something that it's a tough subject. It's really difficult. Again, I got enough email about it, even though have no pastoral role at all, that I thought, we need to do something. We need to devote some time on the podcast to this. So I'm really thankful that it worked out to have you on, and I hope that people will avail themselves of your work. So thanks for being with us.
Yeah, it's been great here. And by the way, if you go to divorceremarriage.com, you'll find all my material there, and you can read the pastoral book for free.
All right. Well, we'll put a link to that on both episode websites. And that'll be a great resource. Thanks for mentioning it. All right, David. Well, thanks again for being with us, and have a wonderful weekend. And
yeah, great to be with you.
All right. Thank you.
All right, Mike. Interesting topic that I know you probably get questions about all the time. So here we have 2 episodes now that we can refer back to about this question. So that was invaluable.
Yeah, it's tough. I thought it was interesting, there at the end that, his church, where he's at, being the one that will marry people if they've been divorced. I thought that was kind of a nice way to land, that it's not that he doesn't take a firm, position, but realizing, pastorally that, like when I asked him about the perpetual adultery question, things are in the past, God forgives, and so we move on. So, yeah, I thought that was a good ending to it.
Yeah, and I like the fact that we went Old Testament and then New Testament, so that was interesting to get both.
Yeah, not all topics. Yeah, I mean, there are topics that don't break down nicely like that, but I'm glad it did too.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was that book again he mentioned there at the very end?
Yeah, I believe it's the Divorce and Remarriage in the Church book. If you go to divorceremarriage.com, you can get the content of that book for free.
Yeah, and also, what is the step? Bible.org? What is that website again? What is it about? That was pretty interesting. I went there and I've never heard of it, and it's
well, it's kind of like, people are more familiar with sites like Bible Gateway, where you can get Bible, the whole Bible in lots of different languages, and even interlinear tools and whatnot. David has his own Step Bible that is quite good. I mean, he's been doing this for a long time. Again, trying to create resources that can get you not only in the translation you like, but also Greek and Hebrew material. So that's what it is. Translations, and then being able to do research online for free. For word studies and things like that.